Welcome to the deep dive. Ready to dive into some social psychology today? You guys sent in some really interesting academic excerpts about group dynamics, social identity, and even crowd behavior.
Should be a fascinating deep dive.
Yeah, lots to unpack here. Why don't we start with social identity theory? It's all about how we define ourselves within groups.
Yeah, it gets at that really basic human need to belong, right? Like, it's not just about fitting in, it's about how those group memberships actually become part of who we are.
Exactly. And, it even helps explain why we sometimes get a little competitive with other groups.
Oh, totally. And the theory breaks this whole thing down into four key elements: categorization, identification, comparison, and this thing called the quest for psychological distinctiveness.
Okay, so first we categorize people into groups.
Right, like based on nationality or their job or even just their hobbies. Then we identify with some of those groups and they start to feel like part of us.
And that's where the comparisons start flying.
Yeah. We want our group to be the best, the smartest, the most talented.
It's like rooting for your favorite sports team. You want them to win, even if you're not the one playing, right?
Totally. And all of this shapes how we see the world. Our group memberships kind of act like filters, coloring how we see events and even how we judge other people.
So starting from a simple question like, who am I? We end up in this whole complex world of groups and perceptions.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
All right, let's shift gears a bit and talk about crowds. What happens when we get a bunch of people together?
Crowds can be wild. You see how individual behavior can change so quickly when people are surrounded by others.
Yeah, and our sources actually make this distinction between active and inactive crowds, which I found interesting. Like, an inactive crowd can turn active in a second. Think about a street performer who starts with a small group of people just watching. Then they do something crazy like a dangerous stunt, and suddenly,
The crowd goes wild.
yeah, everyone's engaged, energized, and totally focused.
And once that happens, who knows what they'll do?
Our research outlines 4 types of active crowds: aggressive, panicky, acquisitive, and expressive.
Each one has its own vibe, right? Like an aggressive crowd, you see that at a riot, or maybe a protest that turns violent.
Right, totally different from a panicky crowd where fear takes over,
Yeah.
like a stampede at a concert.
Ah, yeah. Or you could have an acquisitive crowd, like Black Friday shoppers rushing to get those crazy deals.
And then there's the expressive crowd. They're all about those big emotions, like at a huge celebration or a political rally.
Right, like a giant party.
It's funny how even though all those types of crowds are so different, they all share some of the same psychological traits.
Yeah.
They don't really have a shared goal going in. They're temporary. Emotions run super high, and people can lose their sense of self-control pretty easily.
It's kind of scary when you think about it.
It really is. So with all these different crowds, what actually makes people act this way when they're in a large group? Any ideas?
Well, there are a few theories that try to explain it. One of the first ones is this classical theory, which talks about a group mind. Well, the idea is that individual minds kind of merge together. It's almost like the crowd develops its own consciousness.
Whoa, that's kind of trippy.
Right, but think about a sporting event where the whole crowd is cheering together. It feels like everyone's totally in sync.
You're right. There's this feeling of unity, like everyone's on the same page.
Exactly. And that leads us to the convergence theory, which is all about how people's existing beliefs and values fuel how the crowd acts.
So it's not like the crowd is creating these beliefs, but it's giving people a platform to express them, maybe even amplify them.
You got it. Think about a protest where a bunch of people come together who are all angry about the same thing.
The energy there must be intense.
Totally. It's like their collective action just magnifies those feelings they already have.
So it sounds like to really get how crowds think, we need to dive into this group mind theory.
Yeah. And for this one, we've got some major thinkers weighing in, folks like Le Bon, Espinas, Trotter, Durkheim, McDougall, and Allport. They all have some really insightful ideas about this whole phenomenon.
Okay, so let's break down some of their perspectives. What did they say?
Well, for starters, Le Bon said that being in a crowd creates anonymity, and that leads to people losing their individual rationality.
So we feel less responsible for our actions when we're just one face in a sea of faces.
Exactly. And he also said that crowds can create such intense emotions that people become way more open to suggestion.
So we might do things in a crowd that we'd never do on our own.
You got it. Now, Espinas was more focused on this idea of social consciousness. He believed that a group's shared experiences actually create a collective awareness that goes beyond what any one individual is thinking.
That's very interesting.
Then you have Trotter, who is all about the instinct of gregariousness. Yeah,
Gregariousness.
basically the idea that humans are naturally drawn to groups, like we're hardwired to seek out group behavior and conform to it.
So we're not really meant to be alone.
Not according to Trotter. And then we have Durkheim. He connected crowd behavior to collective consciousness. You know, those shared beliefs and values that hold a society together.
Yeah. So he was saying that crowds can really intensify those shared feelings, sometimes to the point where it leads to extreme behavior.
Exactly. Then there's McDougall, who was a big believer in the group mind. He thought that groups actually have their own mind that can influence how individual members think and act.
So it's not just the individuals influencing the group, but also the group influencing the individuals.
Precisely. And finally, we have Allport, who highlighted these processes of social facilitation and inner stimulation. He basically said that just being around other people can intensify our actions and emotions, even if we're not really aware of it.
That makes sense. It's like we get this boost of energy and motivation from being around others.
Right. So as you can see, we've got this whole mix of perspectives trying to figure out just how crowds work.
And it's clear that the groups we're a part of can have a huge impact on how we behave.
Yeah, and it's not just about physical crowds either. These dynamics play out in all sorts of groups and social settings, right?
You're right. And speaking of going beyond physical crowds, our deep dive also looks at the difference between a public and a crowd. What do you think about that?
It's interesting how they distinguish those two.
Yeah, like with physical proximity. A crowd is all packed in tight, while a public is spread out.
And publics are usually much bigger, right?
For sure. And there's the whole thing about what's grabbing their attention. A crowd reacts to something happening right there in front of them, while a public responds to a bigger issue or idea. Think about a political debate that's on TV, that's reaching a public, not a crowd.
Yeah. The audience could be all over the country, but they're all focused on that one event.
This brings us to another interesting concept: mass society.
Mass society. What's that all about?
It's all about the social and psychological effects of living in these big, impersonal societies where things are constantly changing and technology is advancing super quickly.
Makes sense. Like imagine living in a huge city. Everything is organized and efficient, but it can feel really impersonal. For sure. Our sources talk about how this rise of mass society has actually led to more and more people feeling isolated and lonely, always searching for a place to belong.
It's ironic. We're more connected than ever with technology, but we can also feel way more disconnected from actual human interaction.
It's true.
And that isolation can make us even more susceptible to the influence of groups and mass media, don't you think?
Definitely. When you feel alone and lost, it makes sense that you'd want to find a place to belong, even if the group isn't the best for you.
This makes me think about audience behavior, that whole dynamic between a speaker or performer and the people they're trying to reach. I think that's a super interesting piece of this whole puzzle.
Oh, totally. Audiences are a different kind of group, right?
Yeah.
They all come together for a specific purpose, whether it's to have fun, learn something, or maybe even be persuaded to change their mind.
Yeah, and it's almost like there's this back and forth dance between the speaker and the audience, with each one influencing the other.
Exactly. Our sources talk about how speakers can use emotional appeals, logic, and facts to connect with their audience. And of course, the audience can react in all sorts of ways, both positive and negative.
Like at a rock concert, the energy from the crowd is incredible, but at a political debate, things could get heated.
Yeah, it really depends on how the speaker or performer connects with the audience.
But we can't forget about mob behavior either. That's the dark side of all of this.
Mobs are scary because things can spiral out of control so fast. Our sources say that mobs are often fueled by these really powerful shared emotions like rage or fear.
So it's like individual judgment just gets totally overridden by what the group is feeling.
Exactly. And sometimes mobs are even intentionally manipulated by people who want to use that intense emotion for their own gain.
That's terrifying.
It is. It shows that crowds can be spontaneous, but they can also be controlled.
Wow, we've covered so much already. From individual identity to crowd dynamics to the impact of mass society. It's amazing how all of this is connected.
You're telling me. It's all about how we're social creatures. We're constantly caught between our own desires and the influence of the groups we're in.
And we're not done yet. There's still so much more to explore. We'll be back in part 2 to continue our deep dive into the world of social psychology.
Can't wait. Welcome back. It's crazy how much we covered in part 1, and we're just getting started.
I know, right? So many fascinating ideas. In the first part, we talked about how our social identity shapes how we see things. I'd love to dig deeper into the 4 elements of that theory: categorization, identification, comparison, and that whole quest for psychological distinctiveness thing.
Yeah, let's break it down. So categorization is all about how we sort people into different groups in our minds.
It's like our brains are trying to make sense of the world by putting things and people into neat little categories.
Exactly. But those categories can be tricky. They can lead to stereotypes and prejudices if we're not careful.
You're right. We need to see the diversity within groups, not just focus on the differences between them.
Absolutely. Okay, so then we have identification. That's where we pick certain groups and start to see them as a part of ourselves.
It's like choosing your team. Suddenly, you feel personally invested in their wins and losses.
Totally. Think about how good it feels when your favorite sports team wins a championship. It's like you were out there playing with them, even though you weren't.
You feel like you're a part of something bigger than yourself.
Exactly. And that brings us to comparison. This is where things can get a little, well, competitive.
For sure. We all want our group to be the best, right?
Mm.
The smartest, the coolest, the most talented.
It's a very human thing to do, to want your group to be on top. But it's something we need to be aware of. Otherwise, it can create conflict and tension between groups.
It's like those high school movies where the different cliques are always at odds with each other.
Yep, exactly like that. But luckily, we can choose to appreciate the diversity of all those different groups instead of focusing on the competition.
So that's where the quest for psychological distinctiveness comes in.
You got it. It's this need to make our group stand out, to feel like we have something special that sets us apart.
And sometimes that can lead people to put other groups down, which is never a good thing.
Yeah, it's definitely a double-edged sword.
Hmm.
So we've got the 4 elements of social identity theory. Now I'm curious, how does all this connect back to those theories about crowds we discussed in part 1?
Good question. It feels like there's a link there. What do you think?
Well, let's think about Le Bon's classical theory for a second. He was all about how being in a crowd makes people feel anonymous, which can lead to some pretty irrational behavior.
Right. So how does social identity play into that?
Okay, so imagine you're in a crowd of people who share your same social identity. It could be based on your politics, your religion, or even just your love for a certain band. Being surrounded by all those like-minded people, it's easy to feel like you're blending in.
So you might feel more anonymous and less inhibited because you're part of this bigger group.
Exactly. And that shared social identity can also intensify the emotions that Le Bon talked about. Being around people who feel the same way you do can amplify your emotions, both the good and the bad.
So it's like social identity adds fuel to the fire of crowd dynamics.
You got it. It makes those dynamics even more complex and unpredictable. Okay, now let's switch gears again and talk about mass society. We touched on how living in those big, impersonal societies can make people feel isolated and lonely.
Right. And they're constantly looking for somewhere to belong.
Yeah. And mass society is a fascinating concept because it's all about those social and psychological effects of living in a world that's always changing, super interconnected, and sometimes feels less personal.
It's like we're surrounded by people all the time, but we can still feel incredibly alone.
Exactly. And that feeling of isolation can make us more vulnerable to the influence of crowds and the media.
It's like we're so desperate for connection that we might grab onto anything, even if it's not good for us.
Absolutely. Think about all the online groups and communities out there. People are finding new ways to connect, which is great. But it's not always clear what the rules are or how things can go wrong.
That's true. It feels like the dynamics of mass society and social identity get even more complicated when you add the internet into the mix.
It definitely adds another layer, that's for sure. Okay, let's talk about audience behavior now. What do you think makes audiences so unique?
I've always been fascinated by the dynamic between a speaker or performer and the audience. It's like they're feeding off of each other's energy.
Yeah, audiences are interesting because they have this shared purpose, right? They've come together to be entertained, to learn something, or maybe even to be persuaded.
It's like a dance between the person on stage and the people watching, with each side influencing the other.
You said it. Our sources mention how speakers use things like emotional appeals, logic, facts, and even humor to try and connect with the audience.
And the audience can react in so many different ways. Like at a concert, the energy is electric, but at a political rally, things can get tense.
It really comes down to how the speaker or performer is able to tap into the audience's emotions and beliefs.
It's like they have to speak directly to our hearts and minds.
Exactly. And this dynamic can be used for good or for bad, which is why it's so important to be aware of it.
Now, on a more serious note, let's talk about mob behavior. It's scary how things can escalate so quickly.
Mobs are definitely a prime example of how crowd behavior can take a dark turn. Our sources say that mobs are often fueled by those intense shared emotions like rage or fear, and that can lead to some pretty destructive actions.
It's like logic goes out the window,
Yeah.
and people just get swept up in the emotion of the moment.
Exactly. And sadly, sometimes those strong emotions are manipulated by people who have their own agenda.
That's a scary thought. It reminds us that mobs can be unpredictable and dangerous.
Yeah, it's definitely something to be mindful of. So we've talked about social identity, crowd behavior, the impact of mass society, and all sorts of other things. It's pretty amazing how all these ideas are connected, right?
I know. It shows how powerful these social forces are in shaping how we think, feel, and act.
For sure. It's a reminder that we're all social creatures, and we're always trying to find our place in the world.
I know we're not done yet. Join us for part 3 as we wrap up this fascinating exploration of social psychology. Welcome back for the final part of our deep dive.
It's been awesome exploring all these ideas with you.
I know, we've learned so much about how we interact with each other. You know, one thing that's really stood out to me throughout all of this is the power of social norms.
Oh, yeah, social norms are everywhere.
Like these invisible rules that tell us how to act in different situations.
Totally. They're like those unspoken expectations for how we should dress or how we should talk or even how we should express our opinions.
And it's interesting because everyone just seems to know them, even if no one ever talks about them directly.
Exactly. Like, think about how you behave differently at a fancy dinner party compared to when you're hanging out with your close friends.
Oh yeah, totally different vibes.
Right. And those differences are all about social norms.
It's like we're always adapting our behavior to match what's considered acceptable in that specific situation.
And it's not just about fitting in. Those norms become a part of us.
You mean we start to believe that certain behaviors are actually right or wrong, good or bad?
Exactly. It's not just about avoiding disapproval. It's about truly internalizing those beliefs.
That's pretty powerful. So how do social norms play into everything we've been talking about? Like, how do they affect crowd behavior?
Well, think about a protest that starts out peaceful, but then suddenly turns violent.
What could cause that kind of shift?
Maybe a few people start acting aggressively, and that behavior spreads quickly.
So those aggressive actions create a new set of norms for the crowd.
Exactly. And as more people start following those new norms, the situation can escalate really fast.
That's like a feedback loop.
And remember, crowds are already prone to those heightened emotions and that diminished sense of responsibility.
So when social norms shift towards aggression, those tendencies become even stronger.
Exactly. It can create a really dangerous situation.
Now I'm thinking about mass society and how social norms might influence that.
Ah, yeah, good point. Remember we talked about how mass societies can make people feel isolated and lonely?
And how they're always searching for a place to belong.
Right. So in those big impersonal societies where traditional social structures are weaker, social norms become even more important for guiding behavior and providing a sense of order.
That makes sense. It's like the rules of the game become even more important when everything else feels uncertain.
Exactly. Think about the rise of social media. It's like a whole new world with its own set of norms for how we communicate, present ourselves, and even engage in political discussions.
And those norms are constantly changing too.
Which can make it really hard to keep up. It's like we're all trying to figure out the rules as we go, but the stakes are high because these norms have real-world consequences.
Absolutely. It's a whole new layer of complexity.
It is. But understanding those norms is essential for navigating mass society effectively.
Before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to bring it all back to social identity.
Yeah. It all comes back to that, doesn't it?
It's that sense of belonging, that need to connect with others and feel like we're a part of something bigger.
And it's that desire for distinctiveness, too, that need to feel special and unique.
Right. And all of those drives shape the groups we join, the social norms we follow, and ultimately, the kind of society we create.
We're all interconnected.
Exactly. What we do as individuals can have a big impact on those around us.
That's why it's so important to be aware of these social forces and use that awareness to make positive changes in our own lives and in the world around us.
I couldn't agree more. So as we wrap up this deep dive, think about your own experiences with groups, crowds, social norms, and all the other things we've talked about.
How have they shaped your life?
And how can you use this knowledge to navigate the social world more effectively and create stronger, healthier connections with those around you.
It's been awesome exploring these questions with you all.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the fascinating world of social psychology.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Your support helps us keep creating valuable content like this. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. Join our community for more insights into psychology and personal development. Let's grow and learn together. See you in the next video.